All right, good evening. I'll turn this microphone on, and then I'll really sound official. So here's the guy with the green folder and the papers in front of him, so you know it's the official start of our program tonight. But my name is Steve Perkins. I'm the executive director of the Vermont Historical Society, and on behalf of Richard Watts and the UVM Center for the Research on Vermont, I want to welcome you all to our annual Sam Hand Lecture tonight. Just quickly before I get into these formal written notes that I have scribbled all over my page, I just wanted to, you've all heard this before, but remind you that both the Center for Research on Vermont and the Vermont Historical Society relies on your support and your membership. So if you're not a member for the Center for Research on Vermont, go see Richard. If you're not a member of the Vermont Historical Society, come see me, and we'd be happy to take care of that. So we'll take care of that, and let me move on with the introductions. So in 2015, the Vermont Historical Society and UVM Center for Research on Vermont established the annual Sam Hand Lecture Series with generous underwriting from Arthur and Cindy Miller. And certainly tonight, we are also grateful for support from the UVM History Department. As a professor at the University of Vermont and president of the Vermont Historical Society, you can see the duality here, Sam's legacy at both institutions has been meaningful and enduring. Generations of UVM students attribute their abiding interest in Vermont history to their experiences in his classroom, and his contributions to the scholarship on the subject are vast. This lecture series features topics of interest to Professor Hand, including history, political science, law, and the judiciary. Tonight's event marks the third year of this program. So, with the Vermont Historical Society's exhibit, Freaks, Radicals, and Hippies, Counterculture in 1970s Vermont, coming to an end at the end of this year in December, and the renewed interest in the Vietnam era through Ken Burns' most recent addition to his canon, we focus our evening's topic on that tumultuous time in our history. So Vermont's beloved Senator Aiken, a member of the powerful Foreign Relations Committee, was right in the thick of this debate. How did he play a role in prolonging or ending this country's participation in the Vietnam War? What are the parallels and departures with today's foreign conflicts? So I'm delighted that we have Professor Mark Stowell with us tonight to provide context, insight, and commentary on this topic. Mark Stowell is Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Vermont, where he taught from 1970 to 2007. He's also served as a visiting professor and scholar at institutions of higher learning in both the U.S. and abroad. He's the author of numerous books and articles focusing on World War II and the Cold War. I've got a long list of them here if you want to check them out afterwards. His biography of George C. Marshall is on the reading list for the Army Chief of Staff and Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. And he mentioned to me tonight that he has just finished editing the final volume of the Marshall Papers. I could read the list of publications, but we're going to hold that for later. So at UVM, Professor Stowell has received the Kidder Outstanding Faculty Award, University Scholar Award, Dean's Lecture Award, and I'm going to butcher this, Kreutsch Maurice Excellence in Teaching Award, as well as honorary membership in the university chapter of Phi Beta Kappa. He served on many national nonprofit boards, including those regarding military history and foreign relations. So lastly, if you want to continue your education, you could become a student yourself of Professor Stowell's through the programs offered by the Great Courses Company, available at your local library. So, with that, please help me welcome Professor Mark Stowell.
Great to be back here, and I see all sorts of faces that I remember but haven't seen for a long, long time. So thank you all for coming. There was one thing you left out, the freaks, radicals. I was one of them. I arrived here with a full head of shoulder-length hair. This is what UVM did to me. It's the way I see it. It is a great honor to be giving this lecture, named after Sam Hand, my dear friend and colleague in the UVM History Department for decades. Also, Sam's wife, Harriet, and daughter, Sally, I see faces here that I have seen at too many funerals recently in that regard. But this lecture is named for Sam, and if Sam were with us, I can guarantee you I would face a withering critique of what I am about to say once it was over, phrased in words that would, and sentences that would take me days to fully comprehend. And once I did, I'd say, yep, he is right. In fact, Sam saw the early work on which this was based. Now, I'll be totally honest with you. What I'm going to be saying tonight is not new. It was based on research that I did many, many years ago in the George Aiken papers when Aiken retired from the Senate and actually lived on the UVM campus, which was quite an experience for the students and for the faculty. Aiken also had a wicked wit. The one crack that I love, he and his wife Lola would come into one of my courses, and once in a while I would ask him to speak about an event that I was talking about that he had lived through. And he came up one day and said, I love to attend Mark's classes because unlike many professors here, he doesn't ask me to do his work for him up at this podium. There we go. I can, during the Q&A, I interviewed Aiken. I have a lot I could say about him and about Sam and Harriet and Sally. But Aiken was and remains one of the most respected and venerated figures in 20th century Vermont history. Governor from 1937 to 1941, and then United States Senator from 1941 to 1975. Now, as a senator, he achieved national fame and notoriety as a leading Republican dove on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and a leading critic of the Vietnam War. And his greatest fame lies in suggesting on October 19th, 1966, that the United States simply declare a victory in Vietnam and get out. Classic example, everyone said, of Yankee wit and wisdom. There you have it. Robert Frost personified here. There's only one problem. He never said it. It's a myth. And you mentioned the great courses. I sometimes think that shattering this myth is what led me eventually to do the course entitled The Skeptic's Guide to American History. Historians, by definition, must be iconoclasts. And I ran into this one and I said, wait a minute. I read in the congressional record the speech. And I said, he didn't say, let's declare a victory and get out. What did he say? Let's go further. While Aiken attacked the Kennedy and Johnson administration policies in Southeast Asia, and he attacked their abuses of executive power, Aiken simultaneously supported all military appropriations bills for the war, insisted the United States had a commitment to South Vietnam, and opposed Senate efforts to set a timetable for the withdrawal of U.S. forces. And he never considered himself a dove on the war. And what you had was this fascinating situation whereby supporters of Lyndon Johnson praised Aiken for his defense of administration policies, while critics of Johnson simultaneously hailed him as one of the leading Republican doves in the Senate. His close friend, Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield, said he's not a hawk, he's not a dove, he's a wise old owl, is the way he put it. Now, before I go further, I think it's vitally important, as I'm looking out at the students here, the graybeards my age know this, but I don't think the students do. Aiken's Republican Party during these years bore little, if any, resemblance to the contemporary Republican Party. The same is true of the Democrats. Both parties have changed dramatically during my lifetime. And in Aiken's time, both parties had conservative and liberal wings. For the Democrats, it was the Southern white senators and congressional reps who were the conservative wing for the most part. For the Republicans, it was sometimes called the Northeastern establishment or the moderates, however you want to put it. And I think this fact helped to keep the bipartisan foreign policy going for so many years. There were coalitions that could be made across party lines. Okay, with that said, let's look at the reality of George Aiken and the Vietnam War. First of all, Aiken's primary concerns had nothing to do with foreign affairs. His primary concerns were domestic. Above all, the problems of American agriculture in general, especially small farms in Vermont. Aiken knew very little about foreign affairs. Even though he went into the Senate in 1941, he did not join the Senate Foreign Relations Committee until 1954. That's quite a gap. And even then, he joined the committee because he realized how linked foreign affairs were to two measures he wanted passed to aid farmers. The St. Lawrence Seaway with Canada, which would provide Vermont dairy farmers with cheap electricity and feed grains, and the Food for Peace program, PL 480, to sell U.S. agricultural surplus abroad for local currencies. But very quickly, Aiken found on the Foreign Relations Committee that he had to deal with some key events concerning all of Southeast Asia. And here I'm going to get a little basic, again, because I'm looking at the age of some of the people listening to me and who did not live through these events, okay? Well, first, how many of you watched the Ken Burns series? Let me see that. Okay, not enough, not enough. You should. Okay. Aiken goes on the committee in 1954. 1954 is Dien Bien Phu, the massive French defeat, the Geneva Conference, and the American decision to use the 2-year breathing space before elections were to be held in Vietnam to establish an anti-communist, nationalist, democratic alternative to the communist Ho Chi Minh, who was in the north. Vietnam had been part of the French colony of Indochina since the late 19th century. And from 1945 to 1954, France fought to take back its colony against the forces headed by Ho Chi Minh. The United States had worked with Ho during World War II. And when Ho declared Vietnam's independence from France in 1945, he did so quoting the exact words of the American Declaration of Independence. The French refused to agree, and the result was a bloody war. Franklin Roosevelt had said that Indochina was the worst example of colonialism in the world, and that it would go back to France only over his dead body, which is essentially what did happen. But the United States decision to aid France, and it was a decision really reached, I would argue, the date normally given is 1950, when you really get direct military aid to the French in Indochina. But really, I would argue it goes back to 1947 and the Marshall Plan. Why? Because Ho was a communist as well as a nationalist, and indeed, most Americans didn't believe he could be a nationalist because he was a communist. The two were mutually exclusive in the American mind at that point. To this day, I'm asked, well, was he a nationalist or a communist? The answer is yes. And the reason was because you had that belief that all communists were tools, puppets of Moscow. I argue that this really came from the idea in the 1930s of Hitler's fifth columns in Spain, in Austria, in Czechoslovakia, and that was projected onto Moscow, although it has its own longer history. And I'd be happy to go into that during the question and answer period. There's also the fact that France is one of the nations to receive Marshall Plan aid in order to rebuild and thus prevent a communist takeover of all of Western as well as Eastern Europe. So the aid to the French was at first indirect in terms of Marshall Plan, and then by 1950 it became direct. Now, despite that aid, by 1954 the French had been beaten on the battlefield. The last straw was this defeat at Dien Bien Phu, which was followed by a French decision to sue for peace. The result was the Geneva Conference and the decision to create not 4, 3 independent states: Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, with Vietnam to be temporarily divided for 2 years at the 16th parallel so that military forces could disengage on both sides of the parallel. That was supposed to be followed by unification elections in 1956. Ho and the communist Viet Minh ruled in the north. The south was supposedly under a French puppet government, the Republic of Vietnam, led by the Emperor Bao Dai, who had been emperor under the Japanese as well. The United States never signed the Geneva Accords. It promised not to disrupt them, but privately, the administration of Dwight Eisenhower labeled them, quote, a disaster that would lead to the communization not only of the area below the 16th parallel, but also all of Southeast Asia. And it was in regard to this area that President Eisenhower enunciated the domino theory. You knock over one, and they are all going to fall. I'm seeing all these people my age going, oh yeah, remember that one. Now, to stop this, the United States looked for an anti-communist nationalist who could lead the Republic of Vietnam, and they found him in exile in this country. His name was Diem. And with U.S. aid, Diem succeeded in ousting Bao Dai by 1955 and declared that he would not agree to elections because there could not be free elections in the North where there was a communist government. Eisenhower, in his memoirs, bluntly stated, we supported Diem in this because we knew that Ho Chi Minh would win if elections were held. And at first, massive American aid seemed to succeed. What you've experienced in your lifetimes in the 21st century are not the first American attempts at nation building. This was an attempt at nation building. And at first, it looked like it had worked. This was a showcase to show that it could work. But by 1960, Diem was in serious trouble. Rebellion broke out against his autocratic and repressive rule in the South, rebellion that was militarily supported by the North. Equally, if not more important, Diem was a Catholic in a Buddhist country. And in fact, what you there had been a population movement in the aftermath of the 1954 split. Most of Vietnam's Catholics lived in the North, and they moved south to be with a Catholic government. There was a quip in South Vietnam that when the Americans talked about invasion from the North, the Buddhists said, yes, the Catholic invasion from the North in 1954. Now, Eisenhower sent approximately 900 military advisors in to aid Diem, but it was really under first John Kennedy and then Lyndon Johnson that the U.S. role would expand massively and that this would become an American war. Kennedy increased the 900 to over 16,000 military, quote, advisors. And in 1963, he gave the green light to the South Vietnamese generals to overthrow Diem, after Buddhist monks began to douse themselves in gasoline and set themselves on fire publicly in protest. And then when the communists appeared to be on the verge of total victory in 1964, 1965, Johnson decided to send in major U.S. forces and, in effect, to Americanize the war. By 1968, there were over 500,000 American troops in the area. Okay, that's as much background as I will give you, otherwise it would take up the whole lecture. But if any of you want more, I'll be happy to give it to you in the question and answer period. Now back to George Aiken. Aiken was clearly part of the bipartisan consensus during the Cold War that communism constituted a global threat that the United States had to counter. He also feared that Soviet expansion and communist Chinese expansion were menaces, and at first he had agreed with Eisenhower's domino theory as applied to Asia and the Pacific. But he never believed in a monolithic communist conspiracy directed from Moscow and responsible for all the world's problems. Furthermore, he believed it was important to recognize the limits of American power, something he stated as early as 1960. "We cannot order the world to our liking," he said. And our vital interests, he argued, were not in Southeast Asia, but in the Western Hemisphere and Western Europe. Aiken also believed in general that economic aid was far superior to military aid and military intervention. Such intervention could easily lead to nuclear war and/or an expansion of executive power, which would mean a loss of liberty at home. Kennedy and Johnson decisions and behavior violated Aiken's beliefs and resulted in his public disagreements with them. Now, in these disagreements, in his beliefs, Aiken was also heavily influenced by two additional factors: the previous Korean War and his very close friendship with the Democratic Majority Leader, Mike Mansfield of Montana. Korea had resulted in an unwinnable ground war, the possibility of nuclear war with the Soviet Union, a loss of Allied support, massively increased executive power, a temporary end to the post-war bipartisan foreign policy consensus, and the McCarthy-era search for scapegoats. Those of you who watched the Vietnam series, it did point out this fear of another Joe McCarthy emerging and another McCarthy era taking place, which frightened Eisenhower, which frightened Kennedy, which frightened Johnson, and apparently it frightened Nixon as well. And Aiken clearly feared a repetition of this whole, all these problems in Southeast Asia. Now, Mansfield. Aiken and Mansfield were known as the odd couple in the Senate. Mansfield, the Senate Majority Leader, Democrat; Aiken, the Republican from Vermont. They ate breakfast together every morning, which drives historians crazy because there's no record of what they talked about. I once asked Aiken's wife, Lola, "You sat at these breakfasts. Were they sitting there mapping out strategy?" She said they didn't have to. One would simply say, "Hey, I'm thinking of doing this today. Show up, will you please?" And I'll explain in a few minutes this tandem that they worked out. Now, Mansfield was known in the Senate as an Asia expert. He had taught Far Eastern history for a while. And the crack that you heard from many journalists was that Aiken said what Mansfield thought, that as the Democratic Majority Leader, he could not publicly disagree with Kennedy or with Johnson, but Aiken could. To an extent that was true, but there was much more to it. I don't think that gives George Aiken enough credit for his own independent thought. Aiken saw Vietnam as an unwinnable war and one that would lead to serious problems with America's European allies as well as at home. Aiken was also deeply upset by the lack of consultation with the Senate by Kennedy and by Johnson. Now, under Johnson, there were many meetings, but those meetings were designed to inform and manipulate the Senate rather than consult, as the Constitution had called for. The classic example of this was the Tonkin Gulf episode of 1964. Okay. In response to two supposed North Vietnamese attacks on U.S. destroyers in the Tonkin Gulf, Johnson ordered retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnamese bases. He also requested and received a congressional resolution supporting his actions, a resolution he would later use to justify sending more than 500,000 men to Vietnam without a declaration of war. Now, there's a great myth here that that's what Johnson planned to do when he had the resolution written and passed. That's nonsense, okay? He wanted that resolution to show the North that the country was united in opposing the actions of the communists. What? They said, so what? It didn't work in that regard. And basically, he sent the troops in to avoid, as his Assistant Secretary of Defense put it, 70% was avoid a humiliating defeat. The communists were on the verge of victory in 1964, and this was going to stop them. But let's go back to the Tonkin Gulf episode. As numerous scholars have noted, and as the Senate Foreign Relations Committee discovered in 1968, the entire episode was tainted with duplicity and manipulation of the facts. The North Vietnamese attacks were actually responses to clandestine U.S. South Vietnamese raids along the North Vietnamese coast, so-called O-Plan 34A operations. Also, you had an intelligence gathering operation whereby U.S. destroyers would go into North Vietnamese territorial waters in order to trigger North Vietnamese radar and other defensive installations, and the destroyers would then record, well, this is what the defenses are in this area. These were known as DeSoto, DeSoto patrols. Furthermore, what the White House claimed was the second attack probably never took place. Now, it was not a conspiracy. What happened was it was a dark and stormy night, sorry for the cliche, and someone said, there are torpedoes coming at us. The destroyers began to take evasive action, and they thereby created huge wakes, and the wakes would appear on the radar as enemy ships coming in. There's another fact here, though. The administration had been preparing the congressional resolution for months beforehand and had written it in such a way as to obtain, as one administration official stated, quote, the full support of the school of thought headed by Senator Mansfield and Senator Aiken. The aim? Leave only, quote, die-hard opposition from Senator Wayne Morse of Oregon and his very few cohorts. Well, on the evening of August 4th, President Johnson called Mansfield, Aiken, and other congressional leaders to the White House. And in his memoirs, Lyndon Johnson stated that by the meeting's end, each person there had, quote, expressed his wholehearted endorsement of our course of action and of the proposed resolution. I went to the Johnson Library in the early 70s, mid-70s, when Aiken had retired, to take a look at Johnson's files. His own files reveal that at best this was an overstatement, to put it mildly. Let me give you a few examples. Although unaware of all the facts in the situation, Mansfield and Aiken knew enough from previous Foreign Relations Committee and White House briefings to voice dissent. Mansfield read a memorandum that evening opposing any military retaliation. Aiken reinforced him by warning of possible Chinese intervention, and he questioned the administration's version of events by pointedly asking CIA Director John J. McCone for information on, quote, the provocation, if any, for the second North Vietnamese attack. Johnson, however, had made up his mind, and the dissenting congressional leaders quickly realized there was no way they could effectively oppose his resolution or stop him from using his power as the commander-in-chief to launch the retaliatory raids. As Aiken bitterly noted at the end of the meeting, this is the official minutes, was the senator saying, I will support you, I will support you. Aiken says, by the time you send it up to Congress, there won't be anything for us to do but support you. It was a classic Lyndon Johnson, and Aiken knew he was being had and that he could do nothing about it. Consequently, he voted for the Tonkin Gulf Resolution and all the military appropriations on the grounds that Congress could not oppose the president for exercising his constitutional powers as commander-in-chief. But he made clear that his votes were not to be interpreted as approval of administrative actions and the continued executive war without prior congressional debate and consent, as was called for in the Constitution. And in 1965, Aiken and Mansfield would launch a joint attack against calls for even more escalation from the administration and from such Republican hawks in Congress as Gerald Ford and Melvin Laird, who were hawks at that point. Such coordination enabled both men to overcome the delicate political positions they had. As Senate Majority Leader, Mansfield could not publicly criticize his own president and was forced to limit his opposition to long, confidential letters to Johnson, each of which ended with a strong reassertion of continued loyalty despite the disagreement. As a leading Republican, however, Aiken could openly denounce Johnson's policies and state in stronger language what Mansfield was writing privately. On the other side, within his own party, Aiken could go no further than to state that he was, quote, somewhat disturbed by hawkish statements, but Mansfield could, of course, use harsher language against the Republican hawks. Each could then use milder statements and leading questions as well as words of support on the floor of the Senate to aid the other. And each would say very wise words spoken from the senator from Vermont or the senator from Montana. All of this predated the famous break of Senator J. William Fulbright, the Democratic chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. That break occurred in 1966. All of this was going on in 1965. And what you had was a bipartisan critique by two of the most respected members of the Senate, a critique that could not be dismissed as merely the ravings of a single disgruntled senator or as partisan politics. Indeed, it seemed to have an effect on Johnson, who by late 1965 had stated his willingness to negotiate directly with Hanoi and accept UN help. He also suspended the bombing of North Vietnam, and he asked Mansfield to lead a special Senate delegation on a worldwide trip to explore the possibilities of a negotiated peace. Aiken was selected as the ranking Republican on this mission, and he co-authored the highly publicized report warning that the United States faced either an open-ended and unwinnable military confrontation in Vietnam or a negotiated settlement that in all likelihood would not guarantee American goals in the area. Now, Johnson was polite and proper, thanked them, but refused to heed anything that they had suggested. He resumed the bombing of North Vietnam in early 1966, Aiken's response was to take his message to the people via the televised Foreign Relations Committee hearings of 1966. Those hearings, by the way, especially for students here, J. William Fulbright decided to conduct an advanced seminar in U.S. foreign policy in the United States Senate and over the television screens. It was an extraordinary effort. And I'll never forget, he calls George Kennan, the Foreign Service officer who had authored the containment policy against the Soviet Union, and Kennan says, I never had this in mind. This is lunacy, what is going on. And I, as a student, I had not turned against the war until 65 and 66. And Kennan had an impact on me, as it did on many of us who were studying this. It was, of course, much more to it, but I thought I would mention that. Now, Aiken's statements during the hearings were minimal, but his questions were probing, and at points, I would argue, they were devastating. Administrative officials were forced to admit, in response to his questions, that the Viet Cong constituted an indigenous force rather than a northern invasion, that the Viet Cong were in effect financed in part through the receipt of protection money from American corporations operating in the South, and that continuation of the war could make the United States as totalitarianism as the communism it was supposedly fighting. Yet, Aiken continued to vote for the military appropriations on the grounds that the president was exercising his constitutional authority and that the United States had a definite commitment to South Vietnam. Furthermore, dividing the United States on the brink of a full-scale war he labeled, quote, unthinkable. With Johnson rejecting his advice, the most left to him was, quote, the hope that the president is right and I have been wrong. That pessimism only increased during the ensuing months. If we can get out of Vietnam with the respect of the world and still ensure South Vietnam will be left for the South Vietnamese, he stated on February 21st, it would be a near miracle. Such a miracle was not forthcoming. Instead of ending the bombing of the North, Johnson expanded the number of targets and stopped even the briefing sessions with the members of the Foreign Relations Committee. This is the background. Hell of a lot of background, I know. This is the background to what Aiken said on October 19th, 1966, just before the start of a major strategy conference in the Philippines. It was one final attempt to influence the president as well as solve the contradictions in his own position by suggesting a novel way to begin the negotiations with the North. The real goal of the U.S. military buildup, he argued, had been not the stated and fraudulent as well as unobtainable objective of stopping, quote, outside aggression by the North Vietnamese, but merely to rescue the U.S. troops already in the area who had been in a, quote, clear and present danger of military defeat. It was not just the South Vietnamese who were in danger of military defeat. It was the American forces already there. Johnson's massive escalation had accomplished this goal. He could thus declare a victory and begin not the withdrawal of forces, but their gradual redeployment around strategic centers, as he put it, and substituting intensive reconnaissance of the North for bombing. This, Aiken emphasized, was in no way equivalent to a withdrawal. The United States would have to remain in Vietnam for some time, but the combination of redeployment with cessation of bombing and a declaration of victory would remove the issue of face or credibility as a factor, and it would that had precluded talks. It would force the burden of further escalation onto the enemy, and it would open the door to a resumption of what Aiken called political warfare that had properly characterized the early U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia. Senator Aiken must be joking, quipped the Burlington Free Press. He wasn't, nor was his idea completely original. Senator Frank Lausche, Democrat of Ohio, and numerous newspapers noted that Aiken was essentially calling for a shift to the enclave strategy enunciated earlier in 1966 by retired General James Gavin, but with the novel addition of the statement of victory so as to provide a de-escalation of objectives to match the strategic de-escalation that Gavin had recommended. It was also, of course, a face-saving device for the president and the nation. It may be a far-fetched proposal, Aiken admitted, but nothing else has worked. With the support of Mansfield and Fulbright, as well as extensive press coverage, Aiken became famous for this classic example of Yankee wit and wisdom. And in the ensuing months, he would push his formula while stressing that U.S. forces would have to remain in Vietnam for at least 15 years, and perhaps to the end of the century. Total withdrawal, he insisted, was just as unrealistic as total victory. The administration continued to ignore him, and in mid-1967, he bitterly commented he had no more advice to give the White House. Quote, "They would not take it if I gave it, so why waste my breath?" In the short run, he was forced to admit there was nothing further he could do. Voting against military appropriations with over 500,000 men in the field and a nuclear confrontation possible was unthinkable to him. But for the long run, Aiken began to press two related campaigns, one to defeat Johnson in the 1968 elections, and the other to reassert congressional power to define U.S. foreign policy. The administration, he now began to emphasize, was too bound by its own preconceptions ever to make peace or give U.S. policy the fresh appraisal it so desperately needed. Such a new look in Asia should be the Republican promise in the 1968 elections. Not only would it lead to victory and peace, but it would also mend the hawk-dove split within the Republican Party, which had become quite serious by 1967, 1968. It would mend it in much the same way that Eisenhower had closed the rift between the two wings of the party in 1952. And this was clearly in Aiken's mind as well. Aiken also linked his lack of faith in the Johnson administration to a revival of congressional power by suggesting that the Senate debate the, quote, basic question of whether U.S. national interests required military forces on the Asian mainland. Such a discussion, he argued, was part of the constitutional responsibility of Congress to formulate foreign policy, a responsibility it had, quote, almost totally abdicated during the past decade. At the same time, he renewed his calls for a U.S. move to get the UN involved, not because he thought that would work, but because it would show the Soviet Union's part in continuing the war and would begin to reestablish this congressional definition of policy. And in October of 1967, he and Mansfield co-sponsored a sense of the Senate resolution requesting the president to submit the entire conflict to the UN Security Council. The administration responded by questioning the loyalty of Senate dissenters, at which point Aiken pointed to his voting record for war funds and accused the White House of attempting to make Congress the scapegoat for its own errors. The White House, he said, had become, quote, the prisoner of its own bad rhetoric in its attempts to justify the stupidity and lack of imagination involved in fighting nationalist firsts and communists incidentally in Southeast Asia. The monolithic communist conspiracy he now bluntly labeled a myth, an act of invention, and a self-destructive fantasy. Political negotiations via his 1966 formula still constituted the best alternative, though he warned that this was only a first step and that U.S. forces would have to remain in Vietnam for some time. He reiterated these beliefs after the stunning Tet Offensive of early 1968 and Johnson's subsequent decision to halt the bombing, begin peace talks, and not seek re-election. By year's end, Aiken had also concluded that the peace talks would fail, and he had returned to the idea originally expressed as a hope in early 1966 that the war would gradually fade away as the U.S. withdrew its forces and bolstered the Saigon government. That was exactly the policy of the newly elected Republican president, Richard Nixon. Phased withdrawal and Vietnamization were in complete accord with Aiken's thinking, and Aiken therefore gave Nixon substantial support in the Senate. He argued against any precipitous withdrawal. He said this would lead to chaos in the South, massacre of U.S. supporters, and a new McCarthy era at home as people searched for scapegoats. The past, he argued, could not simply be undone. Southeast Asia, he ruefully stated, quote, is and will remain an important area of national security, if only because we so foolishly made it so. Aiken also maintained that the complex specifics of gradual withdrawal were the president's proper responsibility. The function of Congress was to define, not execute, policy. Aiken therefore urged his colleagues to cease criticizing Nixon's actions and instead regain their constitutional role by defining U.S. policy in light of the Vietnam experience. This redefinition should overthrow what he labeled the New Deal concepts and methods of the past 35 years, which he felt had led to Vietnam, and replace them with a realistic understanding of the limits of American power, as well as new machinery for execution, and legislative, executive, as well as inter-party cooperation. In line with this, Aiken consistently defended Nixon against his Senate detractors. He did oppose the Cambodian invasion and the Laotian invasion of 1970-71, but in relatively mild terms, and he defended the president's right to do this. He attacked all Senate timetables for withdrawal as abuses of legislative power. He supported the 1972 bombing of the North, and he constantly reminded his colleagues of the steadily decreasing numbers of U.S. troops and deaths in the area. He also sarcastically implied that their, quote, conversion to his 1966 ideas were motivated by partisan politics. Why, he asked, had so many of these Democratic dissenters begun to champion his views only when a Republican took over the White House? Now, unlike his experience in the 60s, Aiken now saw significant executive action to support his ideas. The entire Nixon-Kissinger grand design, including the Nixon Doctrine on the use of indigenous forces, fit in perfectly with what he was talking about. So did the détente with the Soviet Union and the opening with communist China. He supported the 1973 Paris Peace Accords and, of course, the final withdrawal from U.S. forces, all in line with recommendations he had made. But instead of a healthy Saigon government or a new era of executive congressional cooperation and bipartisanship in foreign affairs, Aiken witnessed a steadily worsening situation in both Vietnam and Washington, one that culminated in 1974-75 in the fall not only of Saigon, but of Richard Nixon. Okay, what are we to conclude? That's the story. Then he retires from the Senate in 1974. How do we define George Aiken? How do we place him? It seems that he doesn't fit into any of the categories that we have. And trying to evaluate what he accomplished is equally frustrating. On the surface, it would seem he didn't achieve a thing. His advice was ignored by the White House and by most of his colleagues, and his hopes were dashed again and again. Ironically, he appears to have won fame and notoriety for something that he never said and for a position he never held over an issue he tried unsuccessfully to keep unimportant. But I think we should look at what did not happen as well as what did happen. Johnson did not escalate the war to the point of bringing China into it, for example, which is what had happened in Korea in 1950 and 51. The Hawks did not gain control of the Republican Party during the 1960s and early 70s. Aiken's role in preventing certain occurrences is at once difficult to assess, yet obvious. Although his influence and his prestige had never been quantifiable, his colleagues all agreed that both his influence and his prestige were huge. Without doubt, that prestige and influence led many of his colleagues privately to rethink their views when Aiken voiced his opposition to administration policies. And that opposition, in turn, brought respectability and bipartisanship to the anti-war movement in the Senate at an early date. His influence was also apparent in the 1968 Republican position on the war, and one could argue in Nixon's overall foreign policy. Perhaps most fittingly, his views were reflected in the 1973 Paris Peace Accords. As numerous commentators have noted, everyone at Paris appeared to have accepted a modified version of the Aiken formula. While the United States continued to withdraw its forces, all parties to the agreement simultaneously declared that they had won. Thank you very much. Okay, I believe we have some time for questions. And I see a hand flying up from my colleague in political science and longtime friend, Garrison Nelson. Yes, sir.
Okay, back to 64. How much was the Goldwater candidacy factoring into the Gulf Resolution?
The question was, how much was the Goldwater candidacy in 1964 factoring into the Tonkin Gulf affair, the resolution? Quite a bit. I would say Johnson had two goals, and I'm sorry I didn't mention the other one, which you hit on, which was to defang Goldwater, defang the attack on Johnson for being soft on communism. But I think for Johnson, you could never separate with LBJ what was politically something he wanted to do versus what was correct policy in the world. It was give the North a warning. We're not backing down. We are serious. The North said, so what? So what? Le Duan said, we'll just keep sending them. We'll just keep sending them. Yes? How are you, Steve?
Good evening.
Good evening. Steve Terry, former aide to Senator Aiken.
Right. I was an aide to Senator Aiken from 1969 to 1975 when he left. So, first of all, thank you for your lecture. It was well done. There are just a few little observations I would make. Number one, Senator Aiken was a favorite of the Washington Press Corps. And when his remarks, as Mark very accurately stated, what he did say got reduced by journalistic shorthand as declare victory and withdraw. It is important to note that, and I was a journalist before I joined the staff, that Senator Aiken never went out of his way, Mark, to disabuse journalists of his shorthanded version of it. So that was another of his own rather ingenious way, I think, the way that he got influence when he didn't have actual power. I'd like to comment on why he went to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
Please.
1954.
Can you all hear him?
Aiken was a very important, he had a spot for 12 years on the Labor and Public Welfare Committee. He was a ranking Republican. There was concern that Joe McCarthy would use his seniority power to claim a seat on Senate Foreign Relations. So the powers that be also convinced Aiken that he should do that, which he was glad to do. The irony is, when he first went to Washington in 1941, Senator Aiken was what you would call an isolationist. In fact, his most important first vote was in February 1941, when he voted against the Lend-Lease Act. And then later on, of course, he becomes as you accurately portray, a very internationally minded senator. My last comment is, you're right that the Nixon Vietnamization had the seeds in the Aiken strategy. But Aiken was also basically a person who would say, I trust, but verify. So one of my jobs as his aide, and there was only, by the way, 9 people on Aiken's staff, was to every week I had located, and I don't know how now I did this, somebody in the Pentagon whose job it was to keep count of the American troops in Vietnam and how many were withdrawn by the week. And every Monday morning, I would write a half-a-page memo and give Senator Aiken what the troop count was. And as long as the number was gradually declining, he continued his support of Nixon.
Well, first of all, everything you said that I knew about, I agree with. And what I didn't know about, I wish I had interviewed you before I wrote this. But yeah.
I will say just one thing about Sam Ann. We did a little short book about Aiken's speeches, and we also did a biography with somebody else on Phil Hoff. But the time spent with Sam on that project is a special memory, because as we all know, Sam, he would start talking about something that wasn't obvious at the moment, but it would sort of circle around to what the point was. And we had many discussions about which speech to put in the book.
Oh, yes.
And this was, and the one that you're talking about was one that we talked about a lot.
Yeah.
So thank you for helping.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much. Working on the Marshall Papers, I know very well those arguments. Which speeches are we going to include? Which ones are we not going to include? I do want to... Sam had a very unique mind. I will never forget the student who came into me, the advisee, after the first day of classes and said, I think I'm going to have to drop Professor Hand's course on the U.S. from 1945 to the present. Present at that point was 1979. And I said, why? He said, well, he started talking about Humpty Dumpty and Alice in Wonderland and then the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I said to Sam, I explained to the student, I understood exactly. That's what happens being with Sam for 9 years. I'd come to the point to understand exactly what he was talking about. Humpty Dumpty, we can never put all the pieces back together again from what happened in the past, okay? We're always looking through the looking glass. We are never seeing things as they actually are. And the student said, all right, what about the Cuban Missile Crisis? And I said, well, in a chronological course, most professors will either begin at the beginning of the chronology or at the end of the chronology. Professor Hand, being Professor Hand, chose the middle. 1962 is midway between 1945 and 1979. Stories like that keep coming to mind. And I would always tell people, if you don't understand what Sam is saying, wait a minute. He began the conversation in his own head 10 minutes ago, but he'll come back around, and the whole thing will become crystal clear. He had, I thought, a brilliant mind. His insights, and it took me a while to really understand that. And I'll never forget, sometime in the 1980s, I'd already been there for about 12 years, and I showed him one of my pieces, and he said, finally, you've got a decent piece of work here. I'll just leave it at that. I'm sorry that I went on, but Steve's comments invited some reminiscences about Sam. Questions? I'm sorry, we have only had 2 or 3. Can't be that I've settled all the issues. Yes, sir. Right over there.
Hi. Could you comment more on what Senator Aiken's view of Congress's role in foreign policy was?
Sure.
So,
Yeah.
just more specifically, you said he always voted for funding,
Mm-hmm.
but he had something in mind about reasserting
Yeah.
Congress's role. What was that supposed to look like, and what did he hope to accomplish?
Okay, I would go back here. Did you all hear? Okay, I would go back here to what is the Senate's role? It is to advise and consent. Those are the key words. He saw the Congress, the 2 houses of Congress, as defining policy, what it is, and advising the presidents on the executive actions to be taken in defense of those policies and agreeing to them, okay? And on the surface, Johnson was asking for the advice of the Senate and the House, but it was a sham. Lyndon Johnson was one of the most brilliant political operators in this country's modern history. And he would, he would manipulate people. I mean, the stories go on and on about his ability to do this, first as Senate Majority Leader, and then as the President of the United States. And Aiken realized what was happening. Many of the senators did, but they felt boxed in. Now, Johnson was not the first president to use his executive power to start a war. I love to ask students, who decides that there's a war? Who declares war? And unfortunately, many students think it is the president. He does not. It is the Congress that must declare war. And, but starting with James K. Polk in 1846, presidents have learned that they can get a declaration of war from Congress by using their powers as commander-in-chief to manipulate U.S. forces and put them in harm's way. And at that point, you're going to vote against this military appropriations while your sons are out there bleeding? It becomes a political impossibility. So even though the Whig Party vehemently opposed Polk's war, they voted for it. Actually, there never was a declaration of war. It was a rider attached to the military appropriations bill that said Polk argued American blood had been shed upon American soil. It was disputed soil. But the rider said, war exists by act of Mexico. It was also the fact that the one national party to oppose a war, the Federalist Party, that proved to be the death knell of that party. And other political parties learned the lesson. You don't go directly at it. But what Aiken was getting at, as I see it, Steve, and correct me if I'm wrong, he wanted a reassertion of the congressional power to define policy, to advise a president, to agree with the president on certain actions taken. He was a foe of what Arthur Schlesinger Jr. labeled the imperial presidency that had grown up in the 20th century. I don't want to go on too long. I could do a whole 3-hour seminar on this, but it's a very good question. Have I answered your question adequately?
Yes, I mean, what was, he could have been like Wayne Morse, but Wayne Morse, he lost his career.
Yes, Wayne Morse lost his career, and he did not have, one might argue he never had, or if he did have, he lost the credibility that an Aiken or a Mansfield had. These were centrists, if you will. We don't have many of them left. But they were the ones really, who were responsible for some of the greatest moves in American policy in the World War II and post-war years. May I point out the Marshall Plan, got to go back to Marshall, which is often considered America's greatest success. That was proposed by a Democratic administration and passed by a Republican Congress. Both houses of Congress were controlled by the Republicans, and Marshall worked very closely with the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the Republican Arthur Vandenberg, to put this thing across, and they were able to do it. I know that sounds, this was another world, and I agree, it is another world. It's a world that unfortunately we have lost. But that, and with that, if you've got that sort of bipartisan consensus, then it makes sense to say, the Senate is supposed to be a deliberative body, okay? The wise men, if you will, okay? And Aiken is saying, let's take that role back, which was our constitutional role and which the presidents have usurped. And he would start with Franklin Roosevelt, probably, as the first one to do that. Eisenhower, he felt, had not. Kennedy and Johnson clearly had. Now, Aiken is a Republican, so there is partisanship here. Tend to notice that it's the Democratic presidents who are the troublemakers, as he sees it. One other thing about the McCarthy thing, there is a new book on Eisenhower and McCarthy out, which argues, Eisenhower was accused of cowardice in the way he dealt with McCarthy or refused to deal with McCarthy. And in fact, I accused him of that in the Marshall bio. I said it was a cowardly act, what he did at one point. Nichols, the author, defends Eisenhower and said this was, again, Eisenhower's hidden hand presidency. And from day one, the strategy was to destroy McCarthy and everything he stood for. And that it was very carefully planned out, that Eisenhower exercised a type of leadership, the hidden hand presidency is what the political scientist Fred Greenstein called it. Not the direct FDR, JFK, let's go, but rather holding back and doing things from afar. So if you're interested, you might enjoy reading that book about this. And I'm sorry I went on about that. I saw another hand. Yes?
So you may come to it, towards the end, how the Republican and the Democratic Party have changed.
How the Republican and Democratic parties have changed. And here, I fear to say anything with Gary Nelson and others in the audience, but essentially what happened is the Vietnam War broke the bipartisan foreign policy consensus. That was part of it, okay? And especially during the Nixon presidency, the foreign policy debate, the attackers were the Democrats, the defenders were the Republicans. So I would say that was part of it. But the other thing was, Goldwater suffered a massive defeat in the 1964 election, but he and his supporters did not fade away. Rather, they gained more and more power within the Republican Party. As the country changed, the base of each party began to change. And the right-wing ideologues within the party basically came from Southern California and the southern states. You also had the civil rights bills. And the South, which had been solidly Democratic, changed overnight. The 1964 election is really a major turning point. So suddenly there is a viable, strong, extremely conservative Republican Party in the South opposing the entire civil rights era. Okay? So you've got that. Then you've got the Reagan triumph, which is the triumph of the Southern California conservatives over the more moderates in the party. And so what you get is more of an ideological split and a purity test on both sides, okay? If you are a moderate, you don't really belong in the Republican Party. If you're a conservative, you don't really belong in the Democratic Party. But I don't think you still had cooperation. I mean, look at the way Reagan and Tip O'Neill were able to cooperate during the 1980s, okay? Many argue that the big shift came in the 90s. And it was the tactics of Newt Gingrich and his followers that really slimed the entire process. It was take no prisoners. Just direct attack. Why? That's an interesting question. Some have argued, there are many different interpretations of it. One interpretation, which I find interesting, is that Reagan's 2 terms, success, and then George Bush Sr.'s 1 term, the feeling was, hey, we're in charge. We have become the majority party now. The New Deal is over. And then along comes Bill Clinton and upsets the entire apple cart. This was not supposed to happen. And it gave, as Thomas Dewey's defeat by Harry Truman in 1948, which was totally unexpected, gave power to the right wing of the Republican Party. Dewey had been the moderate wing, and they said, look at what happens. So Clinton's success gave power to a more extreme right group within the Republican Party, said, you can't cooperate with these people. They are going to co-opt you, and you're going to lose the elections. So go after it. And you get other famous book, and I forgot the name of it, about blood sport. Blood sport is what this author called what went on during the 90s. And that continued, of course, up to the present day. But again, this is not my field, so I'm not going to stick my neck out any further than that. Now, what someone has to do, and no historian has tried to do yet, is to figure out how Donald Trump took over the Republican Party, because Trump is not a conservative. But that's a whole other story. And we're staying in the 20th century rather than the 21st. Yes, sir?
Following up on the last question about constitutional powers of the executive versus the legislative branch, did Aiken support the War Powers Resolution, and what was his comments on the War Powers Act or Resolution of 1973?
1973.
Shed light for you on his view of the constitutional division of power between the executive and the legislative?
That's a fascinating question that I am going to largely punt on. For the limits of my scholarly research, number one, and number two, the constitutionality of that act has been seriously questioned. That in effect, some have argued it gave away congressional power that was in the Constitution that should never have been given away. Steve, were you around at that point? No?
Yes, I was actually.
I think he voted for it, but I'm not positive.
He did vote for the War Powers Act.
Yeah.
He also, at the same time, and I can't remember if it was that year or the year before, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution was
Rescinded, repealed.
And
Yep.
that helped. Now, the reason I believe Senator Aiken supported the War Powers Act, because he believed something you alluded to, that since FDR, that that Congress had been, and this was his words, declared 4F on the role of making foreign policy.
Yep.
And he really did, he did not like the vast creeping of executive power over
Yep.
war making. And so that's why I think,
Yep.
in fact, I know that's
Why he did it. Yeah. No, absolutely. And this, I forgot what I was going to say, which happens more and more at my age. Again, what Arthur Schlesinger in his book called The Imperial Presidency, Aiken, it's no accident he used that term, New Deal policies. He believes that, now I remembered what I was going to say. When Aiken voted against the Lend-Lease Bill in February, March of 1941, it was his first major vote and his first major speech, he made clear that he did not oppose aid to England. What he opposed was a bill that granted the president as much power as this bill did, because essentially what the Lend-Lease Bill said, the Congress gave the president billions of dollars, really, to use to help any country whose defense he deemed vital to the security of the United States. And Aiken said, that's going much too far. That is something that Congress is supposed to decide, and I will not agree to give away our powers in that way. And his fear of executive power was pretty much a constant in his entire, not only his Senate career, his gubernatorial career, and his opposition to certain New Deal policies in this state because of the power it would grant to the national government and to the president. How many of you younger ones, I still do it too, to understand. How many of you hike the Long Trail? Okay, not too many? Oh my Lord, it's loads of fun to hike the Long Trail. There wouldn't be a Long Trail if Aiken had not opposed Roosevelt, because Roosevelt wanted to build a skyline drive along the crest of the Green Mountains. And Aiken said no. No to that. No to moving high hill country farmers off their land in the 1930s. So there is a constant strand here of opposition to executive power, opposition to overweening federal power.
I think we may be at our time here.
Okay.
So, but certainly continue the conversation in person, but I think some people need to run. And
Okay.
thank you so very much.
What time is it? I didn't even look.
It's 8:30.
It is time. It is time. Yep. Thank you all for coming out.